being able to pull some money from my fund instead of from my budget for the month is kind of nice, because I can still have a nice experience but not have to worry about that taking away from like going out to dinner with my friends or going on a date night with my boyfriend or something like that.
Welcome to the Personal Finance for PhDs podcast, a higher education in personal finance. I'm your host, Emily Roberts. This is Season 3, Episode 11, and today my guest is Lourdes Bobbio, a graduate student in Material Science at Penn State and NDSEG Fellow. In this budget breakdown, Lourdes lists her top 5 expenses, details her financial goals and their underlying systems, and gives her best financial advice for her peers. She shares with us how she has successfully navigated the challenges of quarterly estimated tax, irregular expenses, and her lack of IRA access. You won't want to miss her concluding insight into the psychological benefits of budgeting. Without further ado, here's my interview with Lourdes Bobbio. Thank you for joining me on the podcast today. My guest is Lourdes Bobbio, who is a grad student at Penn State University, and I'm just delighted to hear her budget breakdown today. So we're going to dive into that right now. Lourdes, would you please introduce yourself a little bit further to the audience?
Sure. Thanks again for having me, Emily. I'm really excited to talk with you about my finances as a grad student. So like you mentioned, I am currently a fourth-year grad student at Penn State University, which is located in State College, Pennsylvania. And I am in the Material Science and Engineering department at Penn State.
Yeah, excellent. Are you single? Your household is just you?
Yes, I currently live alone by myself. So
okay. Excellent. Just want to get that structure up front there. So with the budget breakdown episode, I'm basically going to ask 3 super high level questions, and we're just going to dive into those and see where it takes us. And the first one is, what is your income?
So I am currently on the National Defense Science and Engineering Graduate Fellowship. So I make $38,400 a year, which breaks down to $3,200 a month. So yeah.
Yeah, very nice income for a grad student. Congratulations on winning that fellowship. That's excellent. Okay, so that's your income. I imagine it goes pretty far in State College.
Yes, it does.
Yeah, so tell us about your 5 largest expenses, what you're paying for each one of those, so that anyone else can get some, local insight.
Yeah. So yeah, like you mentioned, State College is a college town, so the cost of living is fairly low compared to any of like the major big cities. I grew up near Washington, D.C., and then went to my undergrad in Boston, so was very accustomed to the more high cost of living. So coming here was definitely a big change. So for my 5 largest expenses, I would say my top one is definitely rent. I live in the downtown area of State College, so I pay a little bit more in rent, and I also live on my own with no roommates. And so that's another sort of factor that factors into the higher cost of rent. And it's something that I determined that I valued a lot. I valued being close to campus, being able to walk to work every day, being close to like the restaurants and stuff like that, and then also being able to live on my own. And so one of the reasons why I did choose to live closer to campus is because I don't have a car. So I actually don't have any car payment or insurance that I have to spend money on. So sort of the money that I would normally spend on that, I sort of put it into my sort of rent budget category.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. So first living near DC and then Boston, have you ever owned a car?
No, I have never owned a car.
Okay, so this is kind of a natural choice for you to say, okay, I'm moving to State College. I don't currently have a car. Did you ask yourself, how can I set up my life so that I don't need a car? Is this a common thing for grad students not to have a car?
No, I would say a majority of the grad students do have cars here. I don't think it makes it a little bit easier, just in terms of, since State College, if you want to get out of State College, I would say, because State College is small, there is sort of a limited amount of stuff to do that's within walking distance and within the public transportation sort of area. So if you want to sort of go away for the weekend or something, then having a car is a lot more useful. But I have never had a car, so I didn't feel the need to get one. And there's an abundance of housing close by to campus. And like I mentioned, there is a fairly good bus system throughout the local area that I can use if need be. So
Yeah. A couple more specifics about the place that you live. And did you say the amount of money that you're spending on rent?
So I spend about $1,500 on rent a month.
Yeah.
So it's definitely on the
Sounds a little high to me.
Yeah, it's definitely on the higher end. The apartment I currently live in is a 1 bedroom with it's called an office space. So it's like a smaller, can be a second bedroom. And there have been times when I've contemplated maybe getting a roommate, but I really value having that sort of a space of my own. And so the reason that this sort of came about is because when I first got here, so because this is a college town, it runs very much on the school schedule. So as a grad student, sometimes when you get accepted and then finally learn about finding housing and such, the big cycle of finding apartments is kind of over. Like that really happens in October, November, December. And so when you're figuring out your grad school decision, that's more in the spring. And so when I was first looking at a place to live, there was sort of a limited number of places downtown that I could live. And since I wasn't going to be bringing a car, that's something that was important to me. And so I did find this place. I've lived in the same place for my whole time in grad school. And so for the first year when I wasn't on a fellowship, my parents actually were helping me out a little bit, paying for rent. And they also live close by in the DC area. So they would come to visit a lot, and they liked having that sort of that second office space bedroom to be able to stay over. And then when I did get my fellowship, I sort of evaluated, that also came at a time for my parents when they were no longer going to be able to help me just because of some of their own personal finance issues. And so I sort of had to evaluate whether or not I wanted to move or not. And I sort of decided I liked where I was, and with my fellowship, I could afford it. So I decided to stay where I was.
Yeah, definitely your decision-making process makes sense to me. And the thing is that if you hadn't won that fellowship, I mean, I think you would have had to move, right? Like
Yeah, for
it's
sure.
compared to a, base sort of stipend, it is quite high, but hey, you won it and it's working out and you can afford it. That sounds lovely. And so the reason I'm asking a little bit more about the transportation issues is because it's really sometimes the trade-off makes sense to not own a car and then to pay more in rent, but to have the proximity and to have the access to public transit and all of that stuff. So I'm sort of lumping together your what we would talk about under transportation under the housing stuff. So one more question about that is, you mentioned it's easy enough to get around town.
Yeah.
What do you do about getting out of town? Do you not go, or do you only travel with other people, or do you rent a car, or how does that work?
So I have a long-term boyfriend. We've been dating for a couple of years. So usually when I go anywhere, we go together, and he has a car. So that's usually how that works out. Or sometimes with friends, I would say maybe half of my friends have a car. So we'll plan group trips together and go places. I hardly ever go anywhere just on my own. So.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so let's move on to your second largest expense.
Yeah, so for that, I would say I'm not sure if I'd categorize it as an expense necessarily, but because I'm on a fellowship that doesn't take taxes out, I sort of charge myself the taxes that I would have to pay on my fellowship at the end of the tax year. And so that's sort of one of the next biggest expenses on my list of expenses, and something that I take into account at the beginning of the month when I get paid. I make sure to take out that money right away and set it aside in a savings account so that when I do have to make those quarterly estimated payments, I have that money set aside. I don't have to worry about trying to scrounge it out from somewhere.
So you just mentioned several really important things right there for fellowship recipients to consider. So first, PSA, if you're receiving a fellowship, it's fairly likely that your university is not withholding tax on your behalf. Vast majority of universities work that way. So you are withholding tax essentially for yourself instead of relying on your employer, who is not your employer, to do that for you. So awesome system. Can you tell me a little bit more about how, mechanically you actually do that logistically?
Yeah. So, you mean in terms of calculating or actually setting aside the money?
Both.
Okay. Yeah. So when I first got my fellowship and sort of realized that no taxes were going to be withheld, I sort of had to go through the whole process of, I think it's the 1040 ES worksheet where you input your income, and it sort of takes you through the steps of sort of figuring out how much you're going to owe at the end of the year. And so I did that and got the total amount that I would owe. And then since I also read that you would be paying these quarterly, divided it by 4, or I guess I divided the whole thing by 12, and then would set aside that amount of money per month. And so the way I do this and the way I do all my budgeting is on a spreadsheet. And so I have this budgeting spreadsheet that has the entire year sort of planned out for me. So I do like a 12-month overview of the year where since I know how much I'm going to make every month, it's very steady. I have that amount sort of as the top line, and then from there I take out taxes and then my savings, and then utilities, those types of bills that I know I'm going to have to pay, and then sort of from there calculate how much leftover spending money I have. But that's effectively, so I calculated how much I would have to pay each month if I were getting with basically how much I had to pay the whole year, divide it by 12, and then put that into my budget spreadsheet to calculate. And then I set it aside in a high yield savings account so I can earn a little money off of that until I have to pay it each quarter to the IRS. So.
Yeah, that's just a perfect embodiment of how to handle this, the way that I think is the best way too. So I'm glad we both came to the same conclusion there. I mean, I'll just review a couple things. So one, you figured out what your quarterly estimated tax would be by using Form 1040 ES, which is, for those of you who don't know, it's not something you ever have to submit to the federal government, but it just helps you figure out how much the IRS does expect you to pay throughout the year. If anyone needs extra help with that, I do have a workshop on it that's available year round. And so I'll link that in the show notes. So you use that to figure out how much you need to set aside every single month. And it's just another line item in your budget, as you were describing. Yep. And you have, I would expect, an automated transfer set up. Like after you're paid, it automatically transfers to a separate, as you said, high yield savings account. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the upside to paying your own quarterly estimated tax is that you do get to build it up for a few months before you send it into the IRS, compared to the timing of, withholding. And so, hey, you get, month 2, 3 extra of that little, 2%, interest rate or whatever you get on your savings account. So I love that idea. Do you mind sharing who you bank with to find that high yield savings account?
Yeah, so I bank with Discover Online Bank. I also have a credit card with them, so it kind of makes it easy. And then so that's sort of where I put a lot of my long-term savings. And then I have a checking account with just a local credit union. And that also has a savings account that has a little bit more of my short-term savings goals, which I think I'll talk about a little bit later.
Yeah, sounds perfect. Okay, ready to move on to the next item?
Yeah. So the next item would definitely be food. Both groceries and going out to eat. I definitely spend more on going out to eat than I would like, but I don't necessarily feel bad about it because I generally budget for it and I know how much I can spend. So it usually evens out in that the amount of, if I'm not buying groceries every week and going out, it's a little bit more than I would spend if I were buying groceries, but because it's sort of budgeted into my overall budget, I don't necessarily feel guilty about going out to eat.
I really love that. I also experienced that same sort of psychological side effect to budgeting, which is before I kept a budget, I would maybe feel some guilt about discretionary spending, going out, going shopping, things like that, because I didn't really have a good idea about how it would fit into my overall, cash flow. And I'd be like, okay, well, did I just overdraw myself for like the end of the month. So budgeting really for me ended up being a freeing exercise and something that
I agree.
not experience guilt anymore, because as long as I knew it was in balance and I stayed within the budgeted amounts, I didn't have to feel guilty anymore about the discretionary spending. So I'm really, really glad you mentioned that.
Yeah, and for me, it's also like a way to get together with my friends. Generally, at the end of the week, we'll go out to eat or go out for drinks, and it's just a way to unwind with and like a way to socialize. So again, it's something that I value. I place importance on that. So
Yeah, absolutely. Did you tell us the amount you spend on food?
yeah, so I usually spend about $200 a month on food between groceries and going out to eat. Maybe 200 to 300 depending on the month. So
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
yeah.
seems pretty reasonable, even with a healthy, eating out budget in there. Okay, so what's the fourth expense?
So honestly, aside from those major expenses, I don't really have, utilities, obviously. Utilities and subscription services. I've recently cut down a little bit on my subscription services, just because I realized that there were some that I wasn't utilizing nearly as much as I could, and so I've cut them out. But I spend usually about um, $30 to $40 on electricity per month, and I have it budgeted as $40 because that's usually the highest it ever goes. It's usually in the 30s range, and then my subscription services I think amount to about $25 a month, between Netflix, Spotify, the typical ones you'd expect.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, what made the cut? Okay, so Netflix, Spotify, anything else?
Audible actually made the cut. It was one of the higher ones, and I realized that I love to read, and audiobooks for me are a great way to be able to read while doing lab work very easily. But I realized I was accumulating 5, 6 credits that I just wouldn't spend. So that's almost it's about $15 a month, and I was like, I'm clearly not using this. I realized that sort of every year at the beginning of the year, I sort of evaluate my budget again, and that's when I decided that I'm clearly not using this. I haven't used it for the last 6 months. It's got to go. So that helped cut that down a little bit. So yeah.
Yeah, I just love that you mentioned that you do have a periodic reevaluation of your expenses. And even, earlier when you mentioned, your rent, like after your first year of graduate school, you reevaluated and said, okay, is it worth staying here? I mean, whether or not you decide, yes, it's worth it, or no, it's not, it's the reevaluation that's so valuable and needs to happen over and over again. Just make sure that you're still happy with your situation in every which way. So I'm glad that you sort of have it in your calendar, in your mind, to happen every single year. So that's awesome. Yeah. So is that all the 5 expenses? I think we got through them, right?
Yeah. So I'm lucky that my apartment complex actually has internet and cable included. And so I don't have to pay for those. I probably wouldn't have paid for cable anyway, just because I don't watch that much TV. But it is nice to have the internet included because that can get pricey, especially since here there's 2 major internet companies and not much competition, so it gets pretty pricey. So it's nice to have that included.
Yeah, good to know that that is included in that rent. So it sounded high at first, but then breaking it down, it definitely makes more and more sense. This summer, I'm putting forth extra support for PhDs undergoing career transitions into grad school, a postdoc, or a real job. If you're moving on to the next stage in your career or thinking about it, please visit pfforphds.com/next to check out my articles, webinars, and coaching program. Allow me to come alongside you during this transition to ensure that you set yourself up for financial success. Okay, so we talked about your spending. Let's talk about financial goals.
Yeah. So I have short-term, midterm, and long-term goals, and the way I sort of break these down, I have sort of 2 different savings accounts that I use to break these down. So I have a savings account that's with my credit union, that's connected to my checking account. So I put a lot of the money that I save for my short-term goals in there, and then my more midterm and long-term goals go into the high yield savings accounts. And so, for example, some of my short-term goals, I have just a general travel fund. Since I don't have a car, if I want to go home to visit my parents, I take a bus that takes me straight to DC. But I save up some money, especially near the holidays. It can get kind of pricey. So sort of saving up throughout the year for that. I put maybe like $15, $20 a month towards that fund. And then I have a gift fund as well. So mainly for Christmas, but also for any gifts that come up throughout the year. Definitely getting to the age where I get invited to weddings quite frequently. So having that sort of there means I don't have to dip into my just general daily, monthly budget and can have a separate fund for that. And then I have what I call a fun fund, which is for more higher priced fun experiences. So we have a lot of times Broadway shows come through State College, and those are usually a little bit more expensive. They're like $60 to $70. So being able to pull some money from my fun fund instead of from my budget for the month is kind of nice, because I can still go to have a nice experience, but not have to worry about that taking away from like going out to dinner with my friends or going on a date night with my boyfriend or something like that. And also most recently, I also really like to bake. And so I saw a deal online. It was like a 1-day deal for $100 on a KitchenAid mixer, which is a pretty good steal in my opinion, because I've seen the prices for those. They can range like $300-$400. So I was able to sort of buy that and take advantage of that deal without sort of having it impact my whole budget. So that's sort of what my fun fund is for, and those are some of sort of my short-term financial goals, I suppose.
Yeah, I just want to say, I love this system. I talk about it frequently. I call it a system of targeted savings accounts.
Mhm.
Another term is sinking funds. That's more of an accounting kind of term. But yeah, the idea is just projecting as best you're able what your expenses are going to be irregularly, right? So something that comes up once a year, a couple times a year, and starting to save up in advance for those different categories. And it sounds like you both have expenses that you can pretty well anticipate. Like you mentioned, travel. Okay, it's going to happen around the holidays. I know approximately what amount it's going to be in. You can save up for that pretty easily. But it also sounds like you have, with your fun fund, that's a little bit hard to say, with your fun fund, you have like, okay, it's just something that you have the money there. There's a certain amount of it that you're saving every single month.
Yeah.
And it's more like as opportunities come up and you're like, yeah, I want to do that. This is the fund that you can draw on. So again, it's not impacting your monthly cash flow. It's not necessarily something you've planned out, but it just is something that allows you to capitalize on opportunities when you see them. Like when you saw this sale for something you've been thinking about buying for some time and tracking the prices for. So I really love that you have both like a proactive, like predictive element of this, as well as a reactive, like, okay, I know there's just going to be things that I want to do. So let's plan. I don't know what it's going to be, but I'll be able to do it, when you see it, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So let's talk about those mid and long-term savings goals now.
Yeah, so some of those, so my boyfriend and I, we've been together for about 3.5 years. And so he already graduated from grad school just this past week, actually.
Oh, congratulations to him.
Yeah, and I'll be graduating in a year. So we're thinking about getting married soon. And so sort of planning for a little bit ahead for a wedding, since I know those can get quite expensive. Just putting away like a couple $100 a month towards that. And then also more long-term, a house is something that I definitely would like to purchase in the future. This is definitely, like I said, long-term, but putting a little bit of money away each month for that and just seeing that sort of fund grow. I really like having that. I have a little tracker in Excel, just a little graph that like you can see it sort of grow, and it's nice to see that, and sort of gives me a goal to work for in the future, just like continually working and not having to worry about it like when it becomes a shorter term goal. And so those are some of sort of like my mid and long term goals. Also, because I am on a fellowship, I have to pay out of pocket for my health insurance. And while my fellowship does reimburse it somewhat. It's not as much as if I were a regular, like on a research assistantship. And so it's still quite expensive, but obviously very important. This is actually something that just came up in terms of like my financial life last August, because I was going to be taking off my parents' health insurance. And so I needed to sort of figure that out. And thankfully at the time I have an emergency fund as well, aside from these sort of sinking funds. I have an emergency fund of about $12,000 just set aside. And so I was able to pay for my health insurance, no problem. And there was some issue in getting reimbursed by my health insurance, which could have been an issue if I hadn't, like if it was money that I needed to live on, but thankfully it was just money that I had set aside for this exact purpose, where it's something that I hadn't exactly planned and hadn't really thought of, but was able to pay for. And so now, knowing that and knowing we're going to have to pay for my health insurance in this upcoming August is when we have to renew it, I've been saving aside money for that every month as well, so I can pay for that. So
yeah, what a perfect use of an emergency fund. I thought about what exactly is the definition of an emergency, before. And to me, an emergency is something that is both totally necessary, a necessary expense, and also unanticipated. So you knew you were going to come off your parents' insurance, but you did not know, I would imagine, what the premium was going to be and that there were going to be these issues with the reimbursements and so forth. So, and of course, it's a necessary expense. It has to be paid on time. You can't mess around with that. So it's just wonderful that you have that fund already available for you. So do you have any other long-term goals?
Yeah, so I actually am also currently saving for retirement. And so I was able to, for 1 year, max out my Roth IRA before I was on my fellowship. But since then, and since at that point I learned that I was no longer eligible to contribute to my Roth IRA, I have been investing in just a general taxable brokerage account. And I haven't been contributing as much as I would have probably to my Roth IRA, just because I know that is tax deferred, but I still do try to put in $100 or $200 a month into that as sort of a very long-term goal, and to try to keep that investment going, even though I don't have the tax advantage vehicle of the Roth IRA.
Yeah, so just to expand on that for another moment, because this is something that, I get plenty of questions about. So first of all, your eligibility for an IRA depends on you having what's called taxable compensation or earned income, which in terms of grad student pay means W-2 pay, which is usually termed as an assistantship, TARA. So you having the NDSEG fellowship doesn't count as taxable compensation or earned income. Now, at that point, a lot of people who I talk with throw up their hands and say, oh, well, I have this higher income. I don't have access to an IRA. I guess I won't save for retirement. And obviously, as someone who's very, very pro investing, and especially for retirement, and especially at as young an age as possible, I'm like, no, like you can go ahead. It can't be inside an IRA, but you can still do it. And so I'd really love for you to talk a little bit more about how you came to this understanding and found the way that you're using a taxable brokerage account. But a lot of people don't even know what that is. So like, how did you find out about this, and how did you decide, where to open it and so forth?
Yeah, so when I got my fellowship, and when I sort of learned about all the implications of that in terms of like taxes and investing for retirement, that's when I also learned that I would have, if I wanted to invest, it would have to be in a taxable account. And so I did a lot of research in terms of, I guess, what brokerage I wanted to invest with. And because at the time I didn't feel very knowledgeable about picking funds or ETFs or anything. I had money in a Roth IRA with Vanguard. They make it easy to have target date accounts, but I wanted to try to see if I could try something else, and decided to go with a robo-advisor, an online robo-advisor. So I currently invest with Wealthfront, and have enjoyed the experience so far, and just find it a very easy way to get a broad a broad portfolio in terms of the different stocks that I'm invested in, and they sort of you take a little quiz with a risk assessment, and sort of I'm a little bit on the higher end, and just because I'm young, I know I can have that risk factor, and sort of went in that route. But I did a lot of research in terms of sort of what I felt would be good for me, and how much time I was willing to put into it. And I think maybe in the future I might move this money to somewhere with lower fees. I currently don't have to pay any fees because I'm under a certain amount of money, which is nice. But if I ever were to continue to add money to this account and it went over that threshold, I might decide to move it to somewhere where I wouldn't have to pay an advisory fee.
Yeah, I'm really glad you provided that detail because I learned something new. So these robo-advisors, I've looked into a few of them. Wealthfront is one of the prominent ones. And people often ask me about using robo-advisor. So I'm really glad that you can speak to this a little bit. And as you said, it's a really easy solution. You answer a few questions about yourself and they come up with a portfolio recommendation. I do, in general, think that it's kind of overkill, especially for someone who is investing inside an IRA. And is just going for retirement and sort of a simple thing, what you were already doing inside your IRA.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, it actually makes a lot of sense once you switch to using a taxable investment account that an advisory service with a little bit more of a hands-on approach can do some tax optimization for you. So that actually makes a ton of sense to me. And it's great news actually that, for now, you are not being charged an advisory fee, because that is really the main, as I'm sure you learned in your research, the main downside to using a robo-advisor or any other sort of slightly more expensive service is the fees. The fees don't sound like very much. It's, maybe 0.25%, something like that. Doesn't sound like a lot, but it adds up quite a lot over time. So it's really exciting to me that you were, able to do this without a fee. I mean, that's kind of the best of all the worlds, right?
Yeah.
Do you mind sharing what is that ceiling under which they don't charge the advisory fee?
I believe it's $15,000. And then if you refer people, they will, as a bonus, they'll increase it. I don't know by how much for each person you refer, but I think that is just the baseline ceiling for a no fee.
Yeah, that is awesome to know. Do you want to share your referral link?
Awesome. Can I send it to you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So we'll pop that referral link into the show notes, and you'll help Lourdes and you'll help yourself. If you are already interested in Wealthfront, hey, why not? She's given you a tip about not having that advisory fee at the lower balances. So win-win-win, I would say, all around. We will just conclude with me asking you, what is your best financial advice that you would share with your peers, whether that is another grad student, another fellowship recipient, someone else living in state college, anything along those lines?
I would definitely say, sort of speaking to what you mentioned earlier, is not be afraid of having a budget. I know a lot of people think of having a budget as something constricting and something that will make you not be able to spend money because you're on a budget. But really, it's a very freeing thing, especially as a grad student where you're on sort of a limited income. Being able to see where your money is going and sort of be in control of that definitely makes you feel more free in terms of the things you can do on a day-to-day basis, or on even like a longer term. You sort of get this sort of freedom that I think is really valuable and makes finances just seem less scary.
I'm in total agreement with you about the psychological benefits of budgeting, as well as the actual financial benefits. So thank you so much for sharing that and for joining us today. I'm really, really glad that you came on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed speaking to you.
Listeners, I'm so glad you joined us for today's episode. pfforphds.com/podcast is the hub for the Personal Finance for PhDs podcast. There, you can find links to all the episode show notes, a form to volunteer to be interviewed, a survey, and a way to join the mailing list. I'd love for you to check it out and get more involved. See you in the next episode. The music is Stages of Awakening by Poddington Bear from the Free Music Archive and is shared under CC by NC. Podcast editing and show notes creation by Jewel Lips.